That's the off. Good morning, everybody. Zina's asked me to give you this quick run through design thinking and innovation and the relationship between the two. Um, I don't know how much everybody knows about design thinking, but it's going to be fairly high level, just to understand perhaps how it came about and how it informs innovation and in particular the standards that we've been talking about. A little bit about me. I'm sort of semi-retired or retired now, but for my entire working life, I worked for an industrial design consultancy in the UK called Fraser Designers. And when I started back in 1978, our first project, or one of our first clients, were making the first domestic TV games consoles. And they were very new products at that time. A whole new market was evolving out of computer games that were played in pubs and clubs and so on. And these were domestic ones, and they're very simple. But it basically set the whole company on a course for designing consumer electronics and how people interact with them cognitively. So from a mental perspective, but also physically, ergonomically. And that led us in the direction of designing mobile phones, pocket computers, and toys and games, all of which were, contained electronics, and were using speech, for example, in the toys. We invented a toy that was very successful globally, which combined the printed word and an electronic wand, which could read information off the page. So the whole company was extremely innovative, and we always strived to be innovative in everything we did. But it also that sort of character of the company led us to design for largely entrepreneurial companies, people who are startups working with new technologies or pioneering new markets, which is was very exciting and continued through the whole of my working life, working with companies, working at the leading edge of whatever their market was and their technology was. That we were doing design thinking, even though we didn't probably know it from the beginning, because we were just designers and using the design processes and methodologies that we learned at college and were developing ourselves. And so later on, the term design thinking was coined, and I'll talk a bit about that later. In 2010, I was invited to join actually a European standards committee for writing a standard called Innovation Management Systems. And that was the first innovation management system standard, and it's since been superseded by the 56,000 series of international ISO standards. And I've worked on those, in particular 56,007, and I'll talk a bit about that later. But maybe I'll just start off by talking about design thinking and innovation, and what the differences are. And it's in standards, we often spend a lot of time talking about definitions. So it's really important to understand what it is we're talking about. But we're developing at the moment a definition for design, which has to come down to a sort of working definition, but it's the purposeful transformation from an existing state to a preferred state, which sounds very dry, but I mean, that's what one's trying to do with design. You're trying to improve something, make something better. Better by design, essentially, is the mantra. One's always trying to improve on what's gone before. And it helps, and it particularly helps clients if the results are innovative and they actually stand apart from competition. Design thinking, though, is really a method, and it tried to define what designers did. It tried to put it down in a way that was understandable by other people. But it is simply a process, and I'll take you through that shortly. But it really centers on the end user, the person who's going to be the beneficiary of the design work. Not the company you're working for, but actually their end user, the person who's finally going to be involved in whatever it is you're working on, whether it be a product, a process, a service, And so that focus on the end user is absolutely critical, and empathizing with them. And then innovation, which is quite a lot of controversy about what innovation means, but innovation is an outcome. It is the result of the design process, and you can't have an innovation process because it's not an innovation until it's proven to have produced some sort of value. That could be financial value, it could be an increase in productivity, it could be more effective, it could be just be more enjoyable to use. I mean, it can be, there are a number of different ways of measuring value. So an innovation is something that has proven to produce value, and it's been through a quite a long process to get there, and that process is largely design. There are some other sort of benefits from of design thinking and formalizing it, and one of them is credibility. Designers in the past very often used to work away quietly on their design brief and then come up with the result, lift the black cloth off, if you like, at the presentation, and there would be the result. And it seemed like a mysterious sort of black art how to get to a good design. And so the system that was developed by IDEO and a chap called Bill Moggridge, who was a British designer who went to the United States, went to California in the early 80s. They decided that it would be a good idea to try and formalize it so that it could be shown to clients, to show that there is a very dependable and repeatable process that designers use to get to an end result. And it made it much more open and transparent. So it had a helping clients understand why they were spending money with designers. Secondly, it sort of provided a consistent model for designers of all abilities to work together. They all know they weren't working on their own ideas of how a design process should work. They were getting around a common methodology, and I think that really helped. And finally, it encouraged designers to work together rather than the brilliant, clever person, inventor, if you like, sort of working in his ivory tower. It forced designers to work together, to collaborate, and that often worked much better when you had a multidisciplinary team. So they weren't all designers from the same background. Maybe you had psychologists working with them, or people from different backgrounds and different disciplines. And the outcome of this process of developing design thinking is that it can be applied by anybody. You don't have to be a trained designer to do it. And this is one of its great benefits, that it can be picked up and used by anybody. So this is, in a nutshell, the 5 sort of steps or phases of design thinking. And it starts with trying to empathize with the people who are going to be the recipient of you, to understand exactly how they're going to, what their needs are, what their desires are, but that's done usually by observation and talking to them. So you don't take your client's word, or the person who's given you the brief word for what it is that should be the potential result. It's you have to go and find out for yourself, and that through that process of understanding how they operate with a particular product, for example, that exists already. So you can have a look at what they've got already, the system or product they're working with at the moment that they own and use. You can find out what's the shortcomings of it, and perhaps see forward into the future as to how it could be a lot better. And that leads to a definition of what the real brief is for the design work, which means you can then move to the next stage, which is to sort of prototype it, or to build a hypothesis and some sort of design which you can then test through some sort of prototyping, and that's it really. Essentially, it's an ongoing process that goes round and round, a lot of iteration to go back and improve on what you've already come up with. One of the sort of downsides of that sort of diagram is it's always said that design and design thinking and innovation is a circular process. It's not linear, but I think it helps sometimes to put it into a linear format, because there is a kind of starting point with any challenge or design brief, the Design Council developed a sort of illustration called the double diamond model for design thinking, which starts with a brief. And most from a design point of view, most projects start, or most challenges start with some sort of brief to get you going, because design is a responsive activity. So that shows that this divergence, which is to explore as much as possible all the elements and issues that are around that particular brief, whatever it happens to have been, and that involves talking to people who are going to be using it. And from that, you can start to define the brief more clearly. And I'll show you some examples of how that can change from what was a perceived brief to what actually is now a much better defined guide for what the design work should be doing. So you end up with a problem statement or a hypothesis of what the design should follow, should meet. And you go into the same process again, where you start to think of ideas for addressing that brief that's now being defined more clearly. And then again, convergence again, where you whittle those ideas down. Is a proposed solution a possible solution? And from there, you can carry on to develop it further. So to give you a couple of examples of that, how design thinking can be used, you can take a redesign of a child's car seat. I mean, that's a very defined brief. It's surrounded by regulation and ergonomics. Children are a certain size, and it's a very tight brief. So to design a new one is going to be very similar to what's gone before. It's quite nice having defined briefs, because that means that your areas for innovation are quite limited. But that's a kind of project which comes with a brief that's very tight and surrounded by regulation and so on. But compare that to perhaps designing a system for people without computers to access online services. Now that is a much greater challenge. Doesn't have any regulation around it, but it would require a great deal of working with people who don't have computers to understand how they might interact with a system which you've got to define. So design thinking can tackle very sort of tightly defined problems, and also those with enormous amounts of uncertainty. And I'll come back to talk about uncertainty a bit later on. So I just what I was talking about there about the design briefs often preempting a solution. Another example was 3M, who make films and post-it notes and all sorts of things. They're a chemical company. They were approached by a laptop manufacturer who wanted to extend the life of their battery, the battery in the computer. And they kind of assumed that they needed a smaller, higher capacity battery. But 3M questioned that brief and went back to first principles. And they found that actually they could meet that brief by putting a film on the screen of the computer, which focused the backlight, made it more efficient, which means you could turn the backlight brightness down and extend the battery life. So it shows how you can approach a problem from a different angle and actually just question the brief and not assume that it's pointing to a particular solution, and question it. So let me just have another example. This is an example of design thinking from my own company, and how we used it to redesign or design digital remote controls for Sky back in the 90s. They'd moved from an analog system to a digital system, and they needed a brand new remote control to operate their electronic programming guide, which is now used by everybody, all broadcasters, which is like a table of programs in a vertical format with time left to right of the programs that are coming up in the future. And you navigate across that with up and down, left and right buttons. And when we got this brief, we did a very similar thing. We said, well, we're going to throw away all we know about TV remote controls from the past and tackle it from first principles. And we used the design thinking process. So we talked to users. Our first step was to talk to people who use remote controls, which is just about everybody has a television and a remote control, both adults and children, to understand how they interacted with the remote control and how they used it. And we went through that process of empathizing with the users to find out what their problems were in selecting programs easily, and using a remote control. And that involved designers coming up with some ideas for the shapes of what the remote control should be physically, and also how the buttons should be laid out on the surface of the remote control. We did this rather innovatively by blindfolding people to find out which remote control shape they preferred, whether they thought they had the remote control the right way up, whether it was pointing in the right direction, and what button they thought they had their thumb or fingers on. So that that was really the bulk of the project was actually understanding how people would be using remote controls, and interacting with a new digital on-screen programming guide. On the right here, you can see there are 3 different modes we found that people use to operate a remote control. They pick it up with one hand and hold it between their thumb and finger, and then one finger to operate the buttons. Another was holding it in their hand and operating it with their thumb. And a third method was holding it in 2 hands. I mean, it seems obvious, but actually by understanding that and the frequency that they use those 3 different methods and how many people use them, helped to guide the design. We spent a lot of time working out which buttons were pressed most. So you could put the ones that were the most frequently pressed in the center of the remote control, and then the on-off button, which is only used once at the beginning of a session, and maybe at the end you put at the periphery of the remote control because you don't need to access it very often. So that was a very successful project following exactly the design thinking method, and eventually we whittled the designs down through with the help of users to a single design, which is quite eccentric in a way. It looks like it's got an angle at the front. It's quite a soft design. It's not rectangular. The buttons aren't laid out on it in a rigid grid, and the buttons fall underneath your thumb when you're using it very naturally. So that's a kind of example of how, if you use the process, you can get a very successful result. And those remote controls sold in millions. And we had shown at the beginning these 3 iterations of them. So just to move on to the next sort of stage in this double diamond in product design, we like to add a couple more diamonds to that, because having got a concept, you then need to develop that to be a manufacturable product. And I think that has parallels with developing a service or a process or a system, in that you can get it to the point where you can prove it as a proof of principle prototype or pilot, but then you've got to go through a refining process to get that to be scalable, to usable and on a wider scale. And that requires a different type of prototyping, something which is much more accurate, something that's going to completely simulate what it's going to be like to operate the final product or system. And then there's another step beyond that for products, which is to actually launch it, build a manufacturable and usable product, which then can be you can launch and then get feedback from the market. And I think that's really important as part of design thinking, is that keeping going around that figure of 8, even after it's launched, you're getting feedback, particularly with software. I mean, software is often launched as a beta copy, and then improved once users actually purchasing the product become the guinea pigs for feeding back the bugs and identifying the bugs and problems and improving it for the next iteration. You can't really do that with products. They've got to work the first time. So we go through processes of testing, much more rigorous testing, especially if a product is maybe mains electrical. It's got to be safe to use. So that just to think about that for a moment. Okay, just to catch up myself. So it is a process, very much a process, and different from an innovation management system. And design thinking is really kind of much more related to addressing particular problems or solving a particular challenge. To be innovative as an organization, that's got to be something that is cultural and embedded. And it's not treated as a one-off activity. It's something that is going to be continuous, a continuous process of innovation across whatever you're doing, whether it's product or whatever. You're going to have a continuous process. And so innovation, to implement innovation widely, one really needs to adopt a system. And this diagram here is taken from 56002, the Innovation Management Standard, ISO standard, and it shows that it's more than just the design process in the center here. It's actually surrounded by all the support network and structure that you need to innovate consistently. So very important that leadership understands the processes that are going on through the development from an idea or an opportunity into a deployed solution. And they need to support that. Very often designers tend to be given the job to design by management who don't actually get involved in what they're doing. They just want to see results. And it's absolutely critical in design and in innovation that leadership fully understand the processes that through to implementable or implemented innovations. And within that, you need all sorts of resources and evaluation of the process and how to improve your innovation process. And this diagram here shows the parallel really between what the core of an innovation management system, operational activities to get from an opportunity and idea through to an innovation, with that double diamond or quadruple diamond design thinking process. It's very, very similar. So it shows how important that, I mean, as a designer, I'd argue there's no innovation that's launched in any sphere that hasn't had a design process applied at some point during its development. One of the important things about coming up with ideas as part of a design thinking process is the selection. You'll probably develop more than one hypothesis in addressing a design challenge or an innovation challenge. And from that, you may even have multiple solutions which look like they can actually address and satisfy the brief or requirement. But how you make a selection between those as to which is the best one, especially in areas of great uncertainty where you're working in very new and different markets or with new technologies, is to have a selection criteria process. You can set up selection criteria at the outset of the project for things that any solution might have to meet. It might have to have certain financial constraints. It might have to address particular. You can set out a number of criteria which you can then refer to later. You can even develop criteria as the project carries on. As it definitely through prototyping, you'll discover new challenges and problems which need to be resolved, and perhaps go back through an iterative loop to address some of those. So developing a set of criteria for your innovation or your design project is very important, which you can then measure up proposed concept solutions to really select one from another and select the best one that meets the required brief or the innovation intent. And they can cover resources, third-party requirements, implementation. Maybe they've got to fit with an organization's strategy, and definitely fit with the market and what the market is demanding. And you've discovered through your discovery process and empathetic process at the beginning that you've established that they need to meet. So that's an important element when working with uncertainty, with which there is often a great deal of uncertainty in design briefs and in innovation projects. These are a couple of things what you might want to get hold of to have a look at. Actually, I couldn't find this Harvard Business Review when I was looking at it on the internet earlier. I found it a few months ago, and it's written by Tim Brown, who actually coined the design thinking. But he worked at IDEO while it was being developed, and he coined that phrase. And he writes about it very eloquently. And anything you can find that was written by Tim Brown is about design thinking is worth reading, because he, he's a great expert on the development of it, and also the 56,000 series of innovation management standards. And the one I was involved in was 56,007, which is tools and methods for managing ideas and opportunities, which is really the early stage of an innovation development, and is actually the design methodology, the design thinking methodology, but in innovation management terms. Both very worthwhile looking at those if you're thinking about embarking on an innovation management system. That's it. My top line overview. I don't know if anybody's got any questions they'd like to ask about that. I'm happy to talk about anything I've said.
Thanks, Jonathan. Has anybody got any questions for Jonathan? You're welcome to either put your hands off and come off mute, or type them into the chat functions. And equally, I'd be keen to hear what you have taken away from that as well in relation to your innovation programs. I know for me, it's very much about that end user and keeping the end user kind of involved from the start. So even when you're kind of setting the challenge and thinking about, dialing up our empathy and putting ourselves into other people's shoes, I think that the case study that Jonathan shared around the Sky Remote was great in terms of, trial lots of different concepts in a very cheap way with your end users to help inform kind of which ideas to take forward. And also the importance of that brief and getting that brief right at the start to help kind of shape the outcome that you want to achieve, and using those outcomes within your evaluation criteria again to decide which ideas to take forward. So does anyone have any questions for Jonathan? I mean, a question from me to our audience as well is, how much do you think about the concept of design thinking in your innovation program? Is it something you use on a daily basis, something you're conscious of, or is it something that exists, but as yet have yet to kind of embed in any way? It'd be great to just have a few comments around thoughts around design thinking and innovation. So we've got 38 on the line today, but a very quiet audience. Okay, we have a question or a comment. Let me have a look. What if the task comes in between the different stages?
I think I'm understanding what that means. If you mean there's a challenge or a problem that comes up while you're working on something else, and you're going through that figure of eight. I mean, that certainly does happen. And if you are working on a challenge or a design development, especially when you get to the sort of proof of principle kind of the prototype stage, you can discover things that you didn't know, which can certainly mean you've got to go back to the beginning. You unearth a bit of information about terms and engineering terms that can often be a technological problem. There is an assumption that technology will be able to resolve and meet the design or satisfy the design you're working on, and you find it can't. You might have to go and look for another technology. So that can mean you can have to start again when you're a certain way around the figure of 8 track, if you like. But I think that's what the question might be about.
So it's very much a kind of that's why it's not a linear process, even though we always like to draw things in a linear way. It's a backwards and forwards as the need arises.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you as a manufacturer, you'll be developing a whole series of products and product lines, and very often various models, and they're going to be coming to the end of their lives on the classic sort of S curve, and you're going to have to start bringing in its replacement model before the old one reaches the end of its life. So that is a continuous process of product development and improvement. And therefore, yeah, it is completely circular and cyclical, and not linear. But you do start with a project, and a brief at some point is often seen as a starting point. But it is part of the whole mechanism for developing new products and innovation, that it is a continuous process.
Thanks, Jonathan. We've got a couple more questions come in. A really interesting one about empathy. How is empathy measured in design thinking to enable the correct decision?
Well, empathy means putting yourself essentially in the shoes of the user. And not all designers are experienced in whatever it is they're designing. So they very often in a design consultancy, particularly, which is you're not working as a designer in the company, you're working as a consultant. Every project can be different, every market can be different, every challenge can be different. So you have to learn about it first of all. But then you have to identify with the end users of whatever that is, the end recipients of that process or product. So I suppose measuring it is as much as that once you think you've got an understanding of the target user's perspective and challenges and desires and wants and needs. I'm not sure if you can give it a number in terms of measurement, but you can certainly feel that you've got a fuller understanding of what they're about, so that that can inform your design process.
No, I think that's really nice. And just to interject, I guess working in a pharmaceutical company historically, it was something that we really valued. How do we almost put ourselves in the shoes of our patients? And I know some companies, for example, we were working on a COPD drug. So when you really struggled to breathe, and we sent all of the teams out, kind of a belt they had to put on, and they had to run up and down the stairs with a straw in their mouth so they could get that sense of just how difficult it is to not be able to breathe. And whilst, of course, you're only kind of getting a very small sense of what that must feel like, the anxiety, the panic that could arise, it really just helps you to take that next step rather than just think, oh, I know what it's about, and almost live it even for a few seconds. So I think, Jonathan, again, that example you gave about the remote control, and you blindfolded people and got them to just feel and use something without kind of all of their senses it's just, how do you really step into the shoes of somebody else to really try to understand, and that's absolutely through open questioning and talking to those end users. But are there any other ways that you can really start to feel a little bit about what they feel as well? Because I think empathy is a feeling as well. So just kind of some thoughts and ideas of how you can really dial up your empathy. Yes, it's not a number, but it helps for us to dial this up during this process.
Yeah, so, and I think we're having a number of designers working together who get a different perspective and empathize in a different way to others, and that combined empathy is very, very important. You're not alone as a designer trying to understand everything. If you work in a team, then you'll, as I said, some designers have psychologists in their design team who can work more on that, understand more about how people are feeling and their cognitive understanding, rather than literally the way they interact with the product, for example, physically.
Yeah, no, thank you. So next question, how do you validate an idea in a market if it's required as a solution? So what kind of things would you do to validate your solution?
Well, validation of innovation is that it's produced value in for the stakeholders or the interested parties. So that is your validation, that other people have decided that yes, it has produced value and it is valuable. I mean, that's going to be on a scale. So you have different levels of innovation, incremental, step change, or breakthrough. So those will be defined by just how innovative and how much they change the world, really. And there have been some world-changing innovations. But most design is probably along the incremental level, that it's making small step change improvements, which aren't world-shaking, but they are better than what went before, and they usually often a differentiation in a market. Step change is quite a big improvement, and maybe come in with new technology, and a breakthrough like the touch screen mobile phone, is a breakthrough innovation, which the value is measured by the number of people who adopt it, and they are interested parties and stakeholders. So in a product world, it's the success of the product in its sales, but in the medical field, it's going to be customer satisfaction and perhaps that a new process is introduced that means that they recover faster because the process has been adjusted to in accordance with their understanding their needs. I mean, there's some quite good examples of a post-operative patients being visited at home by the surgeons who performed on them. So the surgeons could actually understand what their recovery rate is like, and how they're feeling, and then feed that back into their surgical processes. And that can be measured through whether patients are feeling recovering more quickly and have less questions for their GPs and so on.
And we'll make this the last question, but actually is looking at the start of the process. Oh, we've got two questions now. So is there a way, so you think, for example, that you've identified a problem or you've got an idea within your market, but is there a way to almost validate that problem is real, that it really exists before you kind of invest in marketing and launching, etc., and going through the whole process?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the proof of principle prototyping. It's relatively straightforward for a product. you can make something which is a mock-up that works along the lines of what you're thinking is a solution, and you can very quickly test it. If it's a process or a system, that becomes more difficult. And I think probably the only way to do that is to have some small pilots where you have worked out the process sufficiently that you can implement it in a very small scale way and test it with a group of users. And that can seem an expensive process, and often come up against that with the financial side of clients, and their financial officers saying, do we need, this is going to be an expensive process, but actually it's much less expensive than the thing being launched and it failing in the market. So you've got to argue strongly for spending a little bit of money to run something like a pilot, to test it, and that. I mean, that's always the big question. People say, well, I want you to design something, I want to be massively successful in the market. Can you give us that guarantee? And of course you can't. But you can. There are processes to mitigate some of the potential risk and problem that you might meet along the way.
So this will be the last question, but it's a really good one. So how can we balance the design thinking's human focused approach with value stream mapping's goal of an ideal zero waste state when setting priorities for innovation and efficiency? That's a big one in 60 seconds.
I think this is where your criteria come in. You have to set your criteria for whatever it is you want. If you want zero waste as a criteria, that's right at the beginning, and then it'll affect the ideas and potential solutions that you identify. It's going to be right at the top of your list if it's important. I mean, and if you can actually rank your criteria as to which are the most important and which are not quite so important to meet. And within that, you can have a scale of how well it meets that criteria. You know, you can have a threshold there that, you know, if there was some waste acceptable, what would be the level? And you could set that at, say, there's a 10% waste would be acceptable, and if it meets that, then, you know, you can move forward with that criteria. So I'd say that's the importance of setting your criteria at an early stage, so you don't follow opportunities and concepts which are not going to meet it.
And I guess it's therefore picking the methodology that works for what you're trying to deliver as well.
Sure. Yeah,
at
absolutely.
the end of the day. Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you for some really insightful questions today as well. That was really, really useful. Thank you, Jonathan, for sharing. I know we had the odd issue with sound there, but hopefully it didn't detract too dramatically. And just to highlight, we have now fixed our next 2 sessions. So on the 10th of February, we've actually got a title now. It's going to be Keeping Innovation Focused, Knowing Who It's For and Why It Matters. So I think that's a really nice follow on actually from today about, you know, keeping person-centric. And then in March, 6 habits that will help you stay productive while fostering innovation by a favourite of Ideas UK, Therese. And as I mentioned, if you'd like to book a one-to-one meeting, just have a catch up and share your objectives and aims for this year, then please do get in touch, Zena at ideasuk.com. But for now, thank you very much. Thank you to Jonathan, and look forward to seeing you next month.